Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture and into Module 2. I'm really excited to get this week started as today you will be starting to read from our first textbook, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and we'll really be getting into the concepts related to communication. Specifically this week, we're going to be talking about the idea of communication competence. And some of the objectives for this lecture include, first of all, defining that concept. So we'll spend some time talking about what exactly do we mean by communication competence. We'll talk about some factors that influence developing communication competence. We'll describe specific aspects of a competence as it relates to communication. And then at the end of the slides, I'll ask you to reflect a little bit on your own communication competence. I've got a few questions for you to think about and try and answer here at the start of the semester. But also, these are questions that you might want to keep in mind and kind of keep on your radar throughout the entire semester as we work towards improving some of our communication competence. So let's jump right in. So as you can see on this slide, I've provided you with a definition of communication competence. This is probably the most well-known and most used definition of communication competence. It was established in the early 80s by Spitzberg and Kupak. They argue that communication competence is the knowledge of effective and appropriate communication patterns. And I think it is important to take a few minutes to unpack exactly what we mean by effective and appropriate communication. And I think one way to do this is to think about what does communication look like if one of these exists but not the other. So for example, is it possible to be effective in the way we communicate but not appropriate? I encourage you to think of some examples maybe from your own personal life. My guess is that you can certainly think of some instances where you have been effective and perhaps accomplished the goals that you attempted to accomplish, but perhaps that was not done in an appropriate way. It might be even easier to think about instances not maybe when you were effective and not appropriate, but maybe someone you're interacting with were. For example, when I asked a student of my undergraduate students, one of the most common responses I get has to do with talking about a coach or coach's behavior. I often have student athletes who suggest that at somewhere along the line they've worked with a coach who did in fact get them motivated or helped them to win a game or perfect a certain skill on the field, but they question whether or not the way in which the coach did that was appropriate. For example, maybe using yelling or some type of behavior like that. So no doubt, someone can be effective, but not appropriate. On the other hand, we can also think about, are there instances when someone can be appropriate but not effective? Again, my guess is you can think of some examples in your own personal life where that's been the case, right? Perhaps you handled a situation very appropriately. You dressed following an appropriate dress code. You sent an email with professional greetings and salutations and appropriate language and grammar, or other ways in which you met the needs of the situation and followed the context in an appropriate way. Perhaps then you didn't go on to accomplish your goals. In other words, you were not ultimately effective in your efforts. So it's all another way of saying essentially competence involves both being effective and appropriate. In order to accomplish communication competence, Spitzberg and Kupak suggest there are three necessary factors: knowledge, ability, and motivation. And again, I think it's kind of useful to unpack these things. And again, useful to think about, well, what if one of these pieces is present, or maybe if one of these pieces is missing, right? So if we look at these three things, knowledge, ability, and motivation, we can imagine scenarios in which some components might be there, but others are not. One of my very favorite studies was actually conducted between a PhD and an MD, a medical doctor, and essentially what they were attempting to do was to examine the difference between happy married couples and unhappy married couples. And they wanted to really get to the bottom of kind of this age-old question, what is the difference between happily and unhappily married couples? So in order to collect their research, they had a very large sample of individuals, both married and not, and they assessed several variables. They engaged in interviews where they asked the participants questions about their relationship. They engaged in observations where they watched couples interact. They even took physiological measures by swiping the inside of participants' cheeks to measure things like cortisol levels, as well as taking blood pressure reports and those types of measures after couples engaged in conflict and arguments. And interestingly enough, What they found was there was actually no difference in the communication abilities between the happy couples and the unhappy couples. That really surprised them, right? Initially, they just simply assumed unhappy couples simply didn't have the same skills that happy couples had. So all that was really going to be necessary was teach the unhappy couples better communication skills, right? And then problem solved. But again, that was not the case. It wasn't a lack of skill or ability that was difference between the two couples. So you might be already kind of on to me, be able to guess what the difference really was. The difference between happy couples and unhappy couples in the study was motivation. It was a willingness to engage in effective and appropriate communication behaviors that differed significantly between the happy couples and the unhappy couples, right? In other words, the unhappy couples knew what could be done, right? And were capable of doing things to make things better in their relationship, but they weren't motivated to do so. They were frustrated. They were full of resentment. They were unhappy in a way that they lacked the motivation to improve their communication behaviors, right? I think, again, that's one of my favorite studies because it really speaks to the importance of collecting data in order to answer questions with empirical observations rather than hunches. But it also, I think, is really telling because it, based on the data, what we need to be doing to help people in their relationships really might be different than what we originally thought, right? If these researchers had simply suggested we need to just take the unhappy couples and strengthen their skills and give them more abilities in order to make them happier, then they would have been really causing some serious damage, right? I like to say it would almost be like kind of like sharpening that knife, right? I'm still really mad and full of resentment in my relationship, but now I really have skills to get you, right? And to really cause problems. Versus now that they have the data to know the motivation is the difference, they can really tackle the problem very differently, right? In order to help couples be more happy and be more satisfied in a relationship, it's not about improving communication skill. It's about influencing the motivation of these individuals to want to use better skills, right? So again, I think that study is super interesting in terms of what they found, but also in terms of highlighting the importance of the motivation component when it comes to developing communication competence. We can think about other examples in which someone might be lacking competence because one of the other two factors are missing. So for example, this isn't nearly as academic, but I like to refer back to the television show The Big Bang Theory to talk about communication competence. Hopefully some of you are familiar with that show. Essentially, in the sitcom, it's about a bunch of very smart neuroscientists and professors and their friendships and their relationships with each other. And one of the main characters' name is Sheldon. He, in general, tends to be kind of the least inept or the most inept when it comes to his communication behaviors. But in one particular episode, he's really interested in getting some lab space to do some of his research. But it just so happens that kind of his arch nemesis is in charge of scheduling the lab. So he does realize that in order to get more lab space, what might be helpful would be if he could befriend the person doing the lab scheduling, right? And so in this particular case, I think you can argue that Sheldon is highly motivated to engage in behaviors to befriend this individual. Additionally, throughout the episode, you could see that Sheldon really works on his knowledge of what behaviors help increase friendship. Right? At one point, you actually see him in the children's section of the library reading through all kinds of books about what it means to be a good friend. So Sheldon has the motivation, he has the knowledge, but quite frankly, he still simply lacks the ability. He seems to be unable to put those things into practice, and when he actually attempts to work on befriending this individual, things just kind of fall apart. So again, we see here all three of the components are necessary for communication competence. For the sake of argument, let's just imagine what it would look like if someone was missing the knowledge piece, right? So imagine a situation where someone is highly motivated and has necessary skill, but simply lacks knowledge, right? Some situations that I think of when I think of this circumstance include things like some of my students in my public speaking courses, right? Often I have students who want to do well in a class and earn grades, good grades. They have the skill or the ability to give effective presentations and to get up in front of an audience and speak to them. But they may walk into the class without the knowledge of what a good speech is. And the student may be unaware of the importance of a really strong attention getter, or the student might not know how to appropriately or accurately cite a source regarding some research that they're using in their study. So in this case, the student wants to do well, they're capable of doing well, but at least at the beginning of the class, they may lack the knowledge of the information in order to do well at public speaking. So ultimately, what I'm trying to convey in this slide is that communication competence is really all about knowing what is necessary, being able to actually perform the necessary skill, and then being willing to perform that skill. So knowledge, ability, and motivation are all key components of communication competence. That being said, it's also, I think, important to point out that there are several stages of communication competence. In most cases, whether we are talking about giving a public speech, whether we were talking about friendship and meeting or sustaining friendships, or whether we're talking about marriage and dealing with conflict resolution or other types of communication within a romantic relationship, there are several different components or stages of communication competence. It's not often that someone simply is or is not competent. Right? And so you can see on this slide here, I've identified a couple of different levels of competence. Initially, someone may be unconsciously incompetent. Right? Essentially, what that refers to is someone who is not even aware of the idea that they are communicating poorly. This person does not even realize that their communication behavior is ineffective or inappropriate. Right? That's really the first level. We move down to the next bullet point there, and you can see that it's possible to have some level of conscious incompetence, right? In this particular case, this person knows what they should be doing, but is just not necessarily able to perform that behavior. And again, I'm hopeful that as you're hearing these things, you can think of all different scenarios or contexts when you may have either fit this description, or you may have been interacting with people that fit this description. The third bullet point moves us down to the conscious competent communicator. In this case, the person typically knows that they are communicating well, and they are working at that in the moment, but it is something that does require a conscious, intentional effort in order to be able to be performing in that appropriate and effective way. And then the highest level here, my fourth bullet point suggests that people can be unconsciously competent. In this case, individuals are able to be competent communicators, to be appropriate, and to be effective in a way that really doesn't appear to require effort or conscious thought. Right? So you can see that really it is important to think about communication competence along a continuum, not just as something people either possess or do not possess. Before I move on from this slide, I'd like to bring up another issue that often comes up in especially my introductory courses, and it's this idea that I think people tend to refer to communication as simply common sense, right? And of course, the article by Gallo that asks you to think about communication as a hard skill or a soft skill kind of gets into this idea as well, right? So if you haven't looked at that yet, make sure that you are looking at the article and you kind of think back to this slide. But yeah, when my intro students walk into the class, that's a very common thing that I hear. I'm here, it's a general education requirement course. I'm here because it's required, but the truth is, I just think communication is common sense. And I thought a lot about how I respond to that idea. And to be perfectly honest, my initial reaction is to agree with them at some level, right? I do agree that communication absolutely is common. Right? Communication is something that we participate on a regular basis, right? Daily. Right? It's really hard to get through your day without communicating in some way. We are all social beings engaged in interaction throughout our day. So communication is common, but I would argue that in order to really make sense of our behavior and others' behaviors, and to really improve at our ways of communicating, that's not so much common sense, right? That's where this idea of really working to enhance communication competence our knowledge, our ability, our motivation really comes into play. So that's kind of where I stand on this issue. I encourage you, again, to think about this more on your own and to really reflect upon this after you have read more from Carnegie's book as well as from Gallo's article. But if we move forward here, you can see in my next slide, I have identified key aspects of communication competence that have been laid out by our National Communication Association. You can see there's a whole host of ideas here. I think in general, these ideas are relatively open-ended in that they can be applied to a lot of different contexts, whether we are talking about an organizational setting or more of a interpersonal a setting. Things like stating your ideas clearly, communicating ethically could be applied in a lot of those contexts. Okay. I'm not going to read all of those bullet points to you. You can read through those and kind of think about it on your own. But what I think you can notice from all of these bullet points here is if we kind of tie them all together, we know that competent communicators possess a couple of key traits. First of all, competent communicators tend to have a high level of something we call cognitive complexity. This is a concept that we're going to discuss a little bit more as the semester progresses, but for now, let me just describe cognitive complexity as the ability to engage in perspective taking and to take another person's shoes. Okay? So highly competent communicators tend to be high in cognitive complexity, which in turn helps them to engage in a lot of the behaviors that we have listed here on this slide. In addition to that, another trait that competent communicators tend to have is that they tend to be high self-monitors. And that probably is a term that you've heard before, but essentially your ability to self-monitor really just refers to your ability to be aware. High self-monitors are aware of how their behaviors are influencing others and vice versa. So you can imagine how, again, that would be related to these more specific traits listed by the NCA. Okay. As we move forward to the last slide here, I'm just going to ask you to take a little bit of time and reflect on your own communication competence. In part, that might be thinking about how highly complex you feel like you are, or might be thinking about your level of self-monitoring. More specifically, I've asked you to think about a couple of questions that I have listed here. Right? And so again, I'm not going to read those to you, but I encourage you when you pull up the slides that are not the narrated version to look through these and think about these. I hope you have these questions on your mind as you are reading through Carnegie's book, and you can also find that these questions are involved with your discussion for the day, or excuse me, for the module. So I think at this point, I'm going to wrap up this slide here. I hope you at this point now have a better idea of what communication competence is, what factors go into becoming, what factors go into having communication competence. And then also I hope you are really kind of starting to reflect a little bit about some of your own strengths and weaknesses as a communicator and what factors might be influencing your level of communication competence. So as always, if you have any questions or you have any concerns about the module, don't hesitate to reach out. And otherwise, I hope you enjoy the unit this week. Thanks.